Let me introduce you to our two visitors. Marcel, pronunciation's bound to be bad. Hertogh, right? His name is Stuart Baker. Marcel is from a Dutch consulting company called Osborne, British origin by the sounds of it, you said, but a Dutch company nevertheless. And Stuart is from our dear Hertogh Transport. But previously, I understand, in consulting, is that correct, Stuart?
No, in the railway industry.
In the railway industry, okay. They have both been kind enough to agree to present to us case study analyses of major transport projects with a focus on project management performance. But nevertheless, which has a very close relationship to what we've been doing, although we've been discussing we're perhaps concentrating less on the project management per se and more at the strategic planning dimension. And there are lots of common characteristics that we've discovered and lots of complementary characteristics which hopefully will lead us in the future to collaborate further in setting up the website databases, case study work that we're doing. So brilliant minds think alike, even though there's a water dividing us between our lives.
Shall we just say a little bit more about ourselves?
Please.
Stuart Baker, I've been in the rail industry since leaving college. Had a whole mixture of operational and commercial roles in the nationalised industry. I was then went right through the privatisation as a deputy managing director of a train operating company. Then went into the Strategic Rail Authority at the time, the government agency, and within my first week began to learn about the issues related to the West Coast Mainline project. Within the second week, I was given accountability for it, and I still got it. I've seen it's been actually quite rare to see something from rescue through to conclusion. And I'm now in the Department for Transport, responsible for all rail investment outside London. So I've got quite a large portfolio of infrastructure schemes. I'm also the sponsor and funder for the recently announced rolling stock programme for new intercity trains for 4 of the UK's main routes. I've been involved with NETLIPSE since, I suppose, just after the embryo idea, and I've been involved in the research and the work, and I've actually found it, the European work with NETLIPSE, very useful to apply back into my own work. So I've contributed, but I've also learned.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Marcel Hertogh. It's a Dutch name. I'm the director at Osborne. We have 150 managers and consultants, and we organize big projects in the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. So also project directors, also big projects. Half of my time I do management of our company, the other half of my time I do projects like NETLIPSE. I hope to finish my PhD within a few months, so this is a very late stage at this moment. And we initiated NETLIPSE, I think in 2003 or 2004. And I was the project manager and at this moment program director.
Yes.
Well, you're perfect now.
Yes. Let's switch off the lights.
Yeah.
Watching the screen.
Is that too dark?
No, it's fine.
We're better to have both off.
That's all right.
Okay, so we have prepared a presentation. If you have questions, please feel free to ask the question. So we want to tell something about our NETLIPSE initiative. What's NETLIPSE? Who are we? what are our goals and what are our plans. Yes, Stuart. Yes. NETLIPSE, what does it stand for? It's a network for the dissemination and knowledge of management and organization of large infrastructure projects in Europe. I said we are now about 6 years working on NETLIPSE, and we did not find another network in the field of management and organization of these projects. We found a lot of networks on technology, rail technology or road safety and so on, but not on management and organization. And if there is, still there is, it don't have very much impact because we and our partners do not help. We had 2 phases of the NETLIPSE project. First is 2006-2008. We had it was a 6th framework European Commission project. So the European Commission funded the first stage. And one of the deliverables was this book. So we delivered it in 2008. I will tell about that. And now we are at the 2nd stage. So we are enthusiastic. Also, the European Commission asked us to continue, and this year we hope to establish a foundation, an institute on management and organization of these projects in Europe, and we want to expand the network. I will explain that further in the slides. Yes, Stuart. What's the motivation? That the European Union and member states address the need for trans-European transport networks. At this moment, about 30 trans-European networks the European Commission has in their program. One of the trans-European transport networks is from Lisbon to Kiev, or very big corridors. And they have already invested billions in the construction. But these organizations facing problems, they have limited possibilities for forecasting and monitoring these projects. So there are a lot of surprises. Face large delays and cost overruns. The European Commission evaluated their program, and they have very much cost overruns and time delays. Why is that? And experience local opposition to the projects. And there's also a conclusion of our NETLIPSE research that the knowledge exchange in this field is scarce, so that we hardly see that projects from one country learn from another. We ask every of the 15 projects we research, did you have contact with other projects, what did you learn from other projects, and most of the time we answer no. Okay, so this is about the motivation. This were the initiators, Stuart Baker. Mr. Leonard Bouter, he's the director of the Ministry of Transport in the Netherlands. 2 professors from Erasmus University Rotterdam and Professor Hertogh of ETH Zurich. He was also the chairman of the scientific board, and he still is. 2 people from knowledge institutes in Poland and Portugal, and 2 consultancy firms. This is a communication consultancy firm in Switzerland and our firm. So, and these are the 8 partners of the first stage of the book. Okay. So we have 3 goals. First, the research of best practices. We say best practices. Best practices. We're going to say good practices and lessons learned. Okay. We researched 15 projects, mainly rail road projects, but also water projects. So large high-speed line projects or railway lines. Like the Beirut first, that's in the Netherlands, it's a €5 billion project. Ring Road Bratislava, Conrad Base Tunnel, and you can read it. 15 big projects, and maybe the similar projects that you were looking at. So in the UK, we looked at the West Coast Main Line, so you was project director, you looked at the City Line. So these were the 15 projects that we studied. Okay. And we our findings we written down in the book. Okay. So what about the research methodology? We started with the knowledge protocol because we wanted every of the 15 projects we did the the same research. We ask the same questions. So we have the same kind of reports so that we can do comparative case analysis on all of the 15 projects. So we had a notes protocol, maybe about 30 pages with the questions. And then we did 2 pilot projects, the Betuwe route, the railway line in the Netherlands and the West Coast Main Line. And after that we evaluated the approach. We found out that there was no need to change it, and the other 13 projects were on the same basis as the first 2. So we started with the NOx protocol, then we had the 15 case study reports. Maybe to get an idea, application reports 50 pages. Then we did the comparative case analysis, and the book, I will tell you, explain this a little bit later. Okay. So each case study report of all the projects has contents of project facts and figures, about stakeholder network, the project history, and these 4 we basically did before the interviews, because when we want to have the interviews, we want to know all the basic facts and figures so that we do not waste time to ask, okay, what is the speed of the train, what's your strategy, and often it's written in documents. And then we can use the interviews, about 10, we have about 10 people interviewed for each project. So we could be very effective, very efficiently in the interviews. Most of the time we did research with 3 people, and we were in favor that people from another country. So from another country, but you also need often people from the country. For instance, when you do research of a Dutch project, so you need Dutch researchers. It is also good to have researchers from abroad. Then we could do the historical analysis, and the core was about the best practices and lessons learned on 8 themes. I will explain that in the next slide, and with the summary. So fixed, tight contents. Okay. So these were the 8 themes, and when you also look in the book, there's about 6, 70 or 80 pages or so about these themes. So we looked at every project from objectives and scope, about the stakeholders, stakeholder network, internal stakeholders, external stakeholders, network, so not only the people but also the network, about the organization, finance, business cases, organizational management, about the risks, not only on the threats but also on the opportunities, contracting, legal concepts, and also technology. So, and it worked out that all of the best practices and lessons learned they have somewhere placed within one of the 8 themes. And these were the questionnaires we had for each theme. So, in our notes protocol, that we have for each theme about 15 questions. So, we asked the questions to 10 people. We had also checkboxes, so we had also sort of quantitative analysis. So we asked, did you do stakeholder analysis? No, not at all. Partly or fully. And we had 5 to 8 checks per theme. So, and then we did also the quantitative analysis. And we ended with 3 general questions. We asked everyone we interviewed what's essential in the success of your project, what's the best practice, and what did you learn personally. Okay? So these are more closed questions in this one. Okay?
Right, before we move on to my perspective on this, do you want to have any sort of questions and discussions on the research or
so this is about the methodology. Okay.
Do you want to just cover that?
Yes. Okay, so I told about the quantitative analysis we did on each theme, and so we had an average score that, for instance, finance and legal concepts and scope and objectives was a little bit better than knowledge and technology, and for instance the stakeholder management. We found out that the hard factors were better organized than the soft factors. So the project has more problems with stakeholders than with financial control or planning. And that is very hard conclusion, so it was unambiguous. Okay?
Right, okay, well I'll take over from there. Just leaving that up, we wouldn't at all, these were pretty common across the 15, and most of the findings were common to the 15. Some themes and findings we might have found in 11 out of the 15, but we rarely found anything diametrically opposed to the majority of this. Some just didn't come out in the research. Just the stakeholder management one. The stakeholder management one there was interesting. The big projects obviously knew how to manage the stakeholders for the purpose of getting the planning consents. They wouldn't have succeeded without that. So the stakeholder management was quite good when they were dealing with the statutory process of consents. And it wasn't bad when it came to neighbours in the main, neighbours of the construction. Generally that was quite good. There were the other stakeholders that were not very well engaged. The potential users, more closely defined obviously in rail and road, but nevertheless the industry stakeholders were often neglected to some extent. But there was almost a total lack of good internal communications. You get people drifting in and drifting out of projects, often from consultancies, and getting the internal stakeholders aligned to the project goals as opposed to the individual contracts was quite difficult. People were working more on their individual elements rather than having a vision for the end product. I'll say a little bit more on how one of the projects will achieve alignment. And I think the last one there says something about the mindset of project managers in the main. It's much more exciting to run into a problem and have good fun sorting it out than avoid the problem or learn from others to start. It's much more fun to have a problem and solve it. And we didn't see a great deal of, as Marcel said, about either learning from others or passing knowledge on. There was one specific example where systematically, because the Danes had been sequenced up Great Bell Bridge, the Öresund Bridge, and are now doing the Fehmarn Belt, that they've actually systematically managed to keep a team. Obviously, with years between them, there's been evolution, but they've really carefully made sure that each bridge has learned from the previous one. Although completely wrong if they took the traffic forecasting on the Öresund Bridge from the Great Bell Bridge, and it was just completely wrong. And I'll explain why again a little bit later on. So this is a little bit of a personal tale, really. I hope you don't mind now. Maybe learn from some of the key things that struck me. So with a busy project sponsorship and funding role, spending some time on the latter three, me being part of the research team, and on the first one having three, because the first two on there were the pilots, and West Coast was the first of all, so having three relatively strange Dutchmen turn up to review West Coast. And West Coast, for those rescuing the mess, and at the time the cost estimates were about £13.5 billion, with 3.5 spent, committed or wasted by rail track. There was about £1 billion complete waste that never led to any. It was in research development. And one of the key lessons from that first dreadful phase of the West Coast is that these sorts of projects are complex enough to deliver without delivering new technology. Engineers love to implement new technology because it's always going to be the best, or of course usually the worst initially. And there's a very strong submission I would make that these scale of projects should not be pioneering new technology. The West Coast was predicated on a technology being delivered in 2003 on the busiest railway in Europe that has just about achieved reliability on two-track railway in Italy or Switzerland with almost no junctions. So, and that's just achieved in 2009. And the functionality that was needed for 2003 will be reliable by about 2016. Just a bit ahead of its time. And those sorts of elements should be left to development projects to be proven and then incorporated into big projects. And there's plenty of civil engineering and other examples that we can think of that you need to prove things. The Germans have used fixed slab track on the line between Cologne and Frankfurt, and it's so hard that the train interface is damaging the track bed. But what do? You've got 250 kilometres of the same new track bed, and it's nearly impossible to repair it because it's a solid concrete foundation. I'm sponsoring, for those of you that know it, the Birmingham New Street scheme, and there I wish that they had done some failing technology. A nice lot of concrete cancer would have justified demolishing it entirely. Whereas I'm having to make do with amending the current structure because regrettably, it is too solid. But West Coast was very interesting because we had a whole host of lessons learned, and by the time we finish West Coast, we've got the second major phase of outputs delivered on time in December and running really well. But we've got further things to come. But the outputs, as I said, will be better, and we spend 9.3 billion, not the 13.5. The usage is better, much better than we predicted. So the Dutch research team looked at both the sponsorship and the delivery side. And I guess, Marcel, that was one of the key elements I brought in personally into the NETLIPSE work, was the understanding of the sponsor-funder role and the project delivery organisation. Because the work on NETLIPSE had been originally mainly looking at the mechanics of delivery of a project, not the strategic purpose and justification, and obviously the end analysis of use. The Betua route set up on the ship, the high-speed ship from Harwich to Hook of Holland, doing an unconventional route, and worked on the ship, and I had no idea what I was going to encounter. It's the first time I've done any of this sort of work myself. And as always, the Dutch were very friendly, and they were very frank and open and honest. And the Betua line did have a strategic purpose. found, and that was essentially to strengthen the competitive position of the port of Rotterdam against Antwerp and Hamburg. That was the sort of main purpose of it, was to get the links from Rotterdam into Germany improved. There was a key issue about sorting out the cross-border issue, because the Germans weren't and still aren't interested in linking up particularly well with the Bethel line, because they'd much rather have Hamburg than Rotterdam. And we've seen this elsewhere. I'm utterly convinced that the Via Baltica from Warsaw and suffering a little bit from the cross-border issue. It was also one that I was quite surprised didn't really have a numerate analysis of why it was being built. And if I can just go back on the slides. And one picture will tell the story. The top picture is one I took on the morning of the site visit on the way to a line, and that's a station called Barendrecht in the southern suburbs of Rotterdam. And the project was originally estimated at around €1 billion to double a secondary passenger line and make it fit for carrying heavy freight. There were then so many objections to the line being doubled and the passenger anything other than just a 2-car diesel unit every hour each way, that they were pretty well forced, and I hope Marcel wouldn't mind me saying this, the group seemed to work on everything has to be a consensus, whatever the cost, and a new line was then determined as the solution, and that doubled the cost. So a new line was then the solution, and then the cost was doubled again because of the environmental objections in the way we had to tunnel and box in part of the line because of objections, noise, environmental disturbance and so on. So from inception to scope fixing, the price went up fourfold. But then, this is actually a box. It's an artificial tunnel over a 9-track railway for about 2 kilometres, with a park on top, in order to box in the railway from the neighbours. Actually, it's boxed in the railway, but because of its height, it's actually boxed the neighbours in as well. They've got no light, but they haven't any noise either. But then, and this is a wonderful example of scope creep. Then it was determined that it was a tunnel, fairly reasonably, and the firefighting arrangements were mandated by the fire authority without justification against the risk assessment. They would only sign off a minimum standard, which is actually a much greater protection than on the Channel Tunnel. And then said, yeah, but what if the water main bursts? So they demanded this artificial reservoir on site to feed the firefighting system in the tunnels with foam added and all the rest of it, so there was an automatic sort of sprinkler system. And then the standards were put in presumably by the engineers designing it, and they went to the European standard lake, which allows for a Latvian winter and 3.5 metres of ice on top. Now this is in the North Sea area of Rotterdam, with frost, maybe 2 millimetres of ice at most, but this lake then had to be built of the depth to allow 3.5 metres of ice and enough water below to fight the fire. So it's it wasn't a laughing matter, but it was in a sense that this actually shows how project scope can do more than creep. It can literally explode. It will go back onto the. So that was, but the project is finished. There were other aspects which are very applicable to rail. They finished it. They were tied up, as with several rail projects, with the same new innovative signalling system, but on a simple railway that I ditched on the west coast as undeliverable. The very same system. There was an odd thing from a railway perspective. It was only a year before opening that they decided who was going to operate the new line in terms of running the infrastructure. And there was quite a lot of tension then. The drawings weren't in the infrastructure company's standard format, the handover arrangements, the maintenance hadn't been fully considered in the design according to the incoming ProRail, which is the Dutch equivalent of Network Rail. So the key feature of railway projects is work out who's going to be managing them for their life and make sure that you've got the comfort on the specification. And that also applies on some of the road projects. The Öresund Bridge we looked at, and this was the only one of the projects that we looked at well after completion. It had been going for 6 years, it's been on for 6 years when we did the research. It wasn't.
You want the slide to Öresund? We have the slides.
Yeah.
Some further.
I guess I'll talk about that. Ignore those, we'll come back to those. But the Öresund Bridge links Denmark and Sweden, Malmö in southern Sweden, and Copenhagen and Copenhagen Centre, Copenhagen Airport. And it was a bridge, a very spectacular bridge, and a tunnel section under the shipping lanes, and to allow free flow under the shipping lane here of traffic. It was a very difficult one to get the go-ahead because it needed the policies of the two governments to coalesce. Very difficult to do a major cross-border project, and you need, obviously, funding and huge amount of impetus from both sides to happen together. Again, quite an important lesson on cross-border projects. And it was a project that was actually much more than an infrastructure project. And that is actually, yes, it was a large infrastructure project in itself. It led to the physical one. It had the stakeholder involvement. It provided road and rail transport, but had a huge societal impact. It had a completely different societal impact than the prediction. And actually, I think one of the key things is when you make a step change in linkages, connectivity, like just over 2 hours London-Manchester every 20 minutes, instead of nearly 3 hours every hour, you just make such a phenomenal difference that modelling can't cope. Standard conventional modelling is quite good at increments, and so it was here. It predicted it would be mainly used for leisure travel by car and for heavy goods, like the experience on the Great Belt. In practice, it hasn't been used for that purpose. Nobody much in Denmark wants to go to Sweden for leisure or vice versa. But it has been a huge economic stimulus for southern Sweden. Sweden has not recently been that strong economically. not by comparison with Denmark. Denmark's got windmills and pigs. Bluntly, because that's it. But Denmark has been much stronger than Sweden, and southern Sweden was perhaps the Swedish equivalent to somewhere like East Midlands in the UK. It was one of the lower parts in terms of economic progression. It was certainly not the southeast as the UK. What's happened is that there's become a zone in southern Sweden that has more mirrored the economic success of Copenhagen area, and the rail traffic's been very good all the way through, and it's just growing and growing, so that there's now a 10-minute service over the bridge, and a new line being built to get 10 minutes off the journey time to Malmö. But the car traffic was predicted as leisure, and has almost all been commuting. And there was a moment of sort of eureka when they put up their traffic graphs through opening, and I found there was an exact match with the post-2004 West Coast traffic graph. They just fitted exactly on one another in shape. Time lag, and then quite an explosion in traffic. So Öresund was very interesting, looking at the wider impact of the project rather than just the project itself.
Maybe Stuart can add something? That we use this scheme, for instance, also at the Betuweroute. Stuart explained that it started from a society perspective, so to strengthen Rotterdam Harbour. But we found out that within 1 year the project imploded, and it was a physical project with standard systems management approach of breakdown structure, of controls, a very inside approach of the project. That's why we also had very much problems with stakeholders. Also with transport and with the transport link. So what we see in general in the projects is that often they start on this level, but after a short period of time there was some implosion or maybe managing like a physical project, and in the end they say, okay, why are we doing this? Stuart explained that this is not static. No, this changes over time. But we think this is a nice figure that helped us in our research.
Okay, well, if you could go back now to the projects. The final one is the Bratislava Ring Road. And again, if you could go. The Bratislava Ring Road was an interesting one, and here I was going to Slovakia with a Polish group to review it. And that was fascinating, and the difference in perspective, the Polish road engineer I was with and I were very different, both characters and interests. And the first sessions we had were with senior people in the Slovak Transport Ministry about the purpose of the ring road and how it fitted into the context. I found that fascinating. And then the afternoon session the same day was from the construction perspective of the Slovak Roads Agency, equivalent to our Highways Agency. And afterwards, we sat down in the main square and had a drink. And Andre said to me, "What a boring morning and what an interesting afternoon." And I said, "What an interesting morning and what a boring afternoon." And I think that just goes to show that there are different aspects to projects. That's the fundamental message of that there are different perspectives. And actually, if you're going to succeed, you need all of those components. You need somebody with the purpose clear, the sort of drive to get the outputs, and you need competence in the delivery. and you need a blend of those two. There were two other things, one planning, one financial about the Bratislava Ring Road. One was, as it turned out, particularly with having chosen Barclays Land and Hitachi for my train project in the UK, but I thought about it then. There was a PFI initiative and the Japanese were funding part of the Bratislava Ring Road. And it never entered the proud Japanese heads that this silly little currency called the Slovak crown would rise faster than the yen fell. And there wasn't enough money to do the road. Because this was an inconceivable thing, that the Slovak economy would do better than the Japanese economy over the period. And just making, that made me extremely conscious about the risks on currency exchange in such deals. I haven't been quite as polite with the Treasury as the escalation in price of my new trains as a result of the collapse of the pound in recent weeks. Best thing, I decided not to have a row with them and just said, of course, most of the reason for this is the currency exchange rate, and you know all about that. You're entirely to blame for it. So there was making sure that you've got clarity across borders and in currency arrangements. And the other one was an interesting tale for those with sort of knowledge of communism, and it's a bit of a shock to me. There are people, I know somebody from Lithuania who can't remember communism. It's a bit of a shock to my system. But it was the planning arrangements. And most of the countries we studied have broadly similar planning arrangements. French are different, they just declare it as a project of national interest, and there's no stopping it then. Once Paris has decided, it happens. But most of the countries were pretty similar. Bratislava was quite interesting. Under communism, everything was devolved. It was devolved to the lowest level of government. So planning was down to the local mayor and the parish council. It wasn't controlled, in this case at the time, from Prague. Because of course it was a democracy, everything was devolved. Except the Communist Party was the glue that held all the layers together. So while the processes devolved everything, the Communist Party came in from the side and controlled everything. So all the structures were devolved. Well, come proper democracy, one would say, in the Slovak Republic, this devolution didn't work because it was anarchy. There wasn't the glue to hold the layers together and make sure that the central decision ever got implemented. And you found parish councils demanding new football pitches or swimming pools as a condition of the planning consent. And actually the week I was in Bratislava, they centralised all planning back up to the top level of government. So they have a democracy centralising it and a communist state devolving it in name. And if you think about it, in less than history rather than projects, every republic in Yugoslavia had the legal right to split off. But the communism and Tito held it together. They disappeared and they all fought one another. And no doubt, after fighting one another 20 years later, they'll all be in the EU, fighting one another over milk quotas rather than physically. But there's an interesting history there on Bratislava, on planning. It was very, very different, and I haven't seen such anarchy. Right, quickly.
I think when we got half an hour
Yeah. Yeah, you talk about the networking. I've picked up most of my things in the 4 stories rather than in the slides. Very little there that I haven't said in the discussion, because I remembered what I was going to say and said it in those 4 projects.
Okay. So I said our research, and first goal was research on best practices and lessons learned. And the second goal we had was that we want to develop a tool, and that's what we call the infrastructure project assessment tool. And the European Commission wants that we develop this tool to evaluate and monitor, we hope, their projects. So when a project starts, for instance, we want a high-speed line in Hungary, they are very interested in the quality of the project management and organization. So the high-speed line may be needed because of the transport, of the network, of society and economy, sustainability, maybe. We want to look at the project from a project management perspective. Is the project mature? Is it wise for is it good that the European Commission funds the project? And is there some assurance that the project team, client sponsor and project delivery organization has sufficient quality? Then after that, it's some kind of quality model, maybe some kind of ISO 9001, a bit more practical. With that model you can also monitor the project and you can do some post evaluation. You can also benchmark projects. This is on the measurement side, but we also want to use it for improvements, because in the tool the things that really matters you want to look at, and that's also the things you have to arrange, you have to organize into projects. So we started in January this year with this development of this tool. In this book we had one chapter of requirements of the model, chapter 7, and now we are sure about funding of the next stage. So the European Commission will fund the next stage 50% of members. We started with the development of that tool. So you can also use the tool as some kind of gate review when one project goes from one phase to another. The third goal is dissemination. It's about a network. So we want to build up a network in Europe for people, organizations interested in how to manage these projects. As I said at the beginning, we find a network, and the experience of the first 2 years of NETLIPSE was that the organizations involved want to continue, and we want to continue the knowledge exchange. In NETLIPSE, I think about maybe a quarter of the budget is on dissemination. So it's on the website, it's on arranging meetings, people coming together, newsletters, and so on. So we have biannual meetings. So we have meetings in London, in Warsaw, Lisbon, in Zurich, and next month in Amsterdam. And we also have every half year a newsletter. You can download the newsletter from our website. And as I told, next month we have a network meeting in Amsterdam at the north-south neutral line. It's in Amsterdam. It's a 2-day meeting where we discuss. We have discussions, we have presentations, and we have a site visit. So I heard that also your project has some interesting meeting in Sweden. So maybe we cannot visit our meetings, but maybe next time. Okay. So we have a website. We will also renew the website in April, that you can download documents, newsletters. And and the NETLIPSE, so the next phase of the website is that we want to let it be more interactive than now. Okay. So we had the next session. So this is maybe for the European Commission. So we had the first project was sponsored by the European Commission, and also the second, but that's easier said than done. Now we have a very good schedule, because we had a call in May 2008 and we hope a contract in May 2009, so that's only 1 year. For the NETLIPSE phase 1 project we had to wait for 2 years before we had the contract, so we had maybe 6 weeks to make the proposal, and then they had 1 year for negotiation and so on. In June, these were the organizations involved in NETLIPSE. We have also current contacts with the European Investment Bank and World Bank, also the Italian Ministry of Transport, Slovakia is also involved, so now we have about 25 or 30 organizations involved. This is our plan for the next 2 years, or phase 2008-2009, that we started in January. So we want to establish the foundation. So we want to a legal entity. We want to expand the network. We want to develop the tool, and we will develop 2 training programs. First for assessors for that tool, and the second more general management training for project managers, decision makers in this field. And we have more project management activities. So I said that we want to establish the foundation. This is the objective. So we want to initiate, promote and encourage the successful development, in particular of these projects, aimed at positively influencing the living environment and economy in Europe. So at this moment we are focusing on Europe. We have also contacts in China and with the World Bank in Washington, but we said let's first focus on Europe, and maybe after 1 or 2 years maybe we can expand the network also to other continents. This is the program for 2009. So we started the development of the tool, we had our 5th newsletter, the network meeting, the contract, we suppose in May, we're now finalizing it. We want to establish the foundation, we want to test the items on 3 or 4 projects, the new newsletter, the new network meeting, and the training of the tool. So that's the very easy program. Okay. So, maybe we have almost half an hour for discussion. Any questions or comments or reactions?
Well, I wonder if I can sort of start by picking up a couple of points Stuart made at the end of his, which strike me as I would put a different interpretation on, and I just wondered how NETLIPSE is actually addressing them. One is the French Déclaration d'utilité publique system, which is actually a formal culmination of a process. I felt you sort of rather put it over as something they do. Sorry, let me continue. The process has expanded quite a bit in the years I've known it. It's still maybe different to what we have, maybe different, I think, to what the Dutch have, but it is a process. And secondly, the point about Slovakia. I've never been there, but I worked on a road scheme in Slovenia 18 months ago, which was quite illuminating as well for sort of the cultural factors behind the Yugoslav phenomenon. I felt, I'm sure Stuart who brought it out. You're also talking about people wanting their big duck pond down the road scheme. But again, going back to the Dutch, going back to the French, part of the European process is a negotiation process as well. These are areas like sort of, in a sense, the social environment, something we're heavily involved in the RAMP project. But actually that gets, that negotiation process within an overall process, building up to a project that takes all these things on board and has a final cost and form, which should then be managed. I would have thought is actually quite an important tool. I'm not sure, didn't get the impression as whether you'd actually analysed that sort of thing and brought it out.
We certainly analyse the costs of projects and the yield for purpose. So yes, we did look at that. Certainly, benefit has been associated with also non-technical team. So yes, we did pick up the cost issues as well as the other areas. And obviously in the impact, cost control of arrangements, risk management, and often risk allocation of both output and cost between partners in a project are all brought out there. Maybe usually we eat out too heavily in those examples. There were pretty clear study of the cost areas. I think most fundamentally we found that after a project's scope is fixed, after the public inquiry and consents in whichever country it was, the delivery was almost always on the cost plan. So the project management was actually quite good. It was the initial, the Betuel line is going to cost €1 billion. Oops, it's going to cost 4. Because people are actually keen to underestimate the cost while they're justifying it. And politicians often want to play down the cost area. The one exception where project delivery was not at the level expected was in the 2 tunnelling examples of the Lurchberg and the Gotthard, where actually simply if you encounter really difficult areas and high pressures, water and so on, that isn't, however much you do test boring and so on, that isn't that predictable. So those are the ones that vary when you're boring a very long tunnel in difficult conditions. But the rest pretty well stay within the estimates and the allowance for risk.
Just wanted to ask a question regarding the stakeholder management. You did mention that across the projects it was a traditional approach, which was to placate the stakeholders sufficient enough to get through the planning process, the necessary consent.
Yes.
My question is whether you've been able afterwards to give some thought to how better the stakeholders might be engaged, whether there are indications elsewhere in the world where the probably are doing it better and how that could be improved.
We certainly saw differences between the 15 projects. Betuel was very good. So was HSL Zoud in the Netherlands, that had a project brand, everything was put out under that name, and the liaison was good. The demonstrations against the building of the line were jointly scheduled. We're going to turn up with a lot of reporters a week on Thursday. Is that all right? Well, we'd rather it was Friday. Oh, we'll come on Friday then. So they had the working relationship, although there were sort of diametrically opposed positions. So I think those 2 Dutch ones were probably among the best.
So what the experience at the Betuel, we have about 30 cities, was that when the city was very much opposing, the result was less for the city than when the city was more cooperative. So
Yes, sir.
so and it was so that we find out. So I think when you hear of new freight line or a high-speed line through your city, you can say, okay, well, what shall we do? Very hard to post, okay, the route will not come there, etc. Let's find out what's also successful. That's when there is an open mind, that you incorporate, understand each other, that in the end you get more, so you are better off than when you go for there's also at the Swiss projects you have, because the Gotthard project and the most debate about for a canton, and proposing canton of about maybe 35,000 people or so. And that gave maybe a delay of 8 years, so much more delay than the boarding process itself. So we have a lot of, also in the book, a lot of experiences from the stakeholder management
There was also a Swiss way of managing stakeholders in the broader sense, because that's the use of a referendum. So there's a referendum of the whole country on Alp Transit, which was improving the two routes, the western Lurchburg route and the eastern Gotthard route, associated with building the railways and increasing the taxation on through transit road traffic. And that was interesting. The Lurchburg has by far the weaker business case, but was deliverable 15 years earlier than the Gotthard, because it was a lot shorter and it was easier. And then they had strategically to decide to put both in the referendum, because if you wanted a country to vote in the way Switzerland divides, you actually needed both tunnels to get a majority vote across the country. So if they'd done one, they'd have had 35%, but they had 56%, I think it was, by putting both in. But having given a vote as a country, they had the supreme advantage that they had a demonstrable national mandate to do it, and just did it. So it was a very, very different approach from any of the other countries. It was the idea of, shall we build HS2? I can't see us doing a referendum of the whole country. The Isle of Wight wouldn't be that interested in a line to Birmingham. So, but that's just the Swiss way of doing things. They used to do referenda over all sorts of things.
So we also see in stakeholder management is that when you look at these projects, with this changing context, and that you read also about concepts of variety. The stakeholders itself use more the concept of variety than project organization, because the project organization is more one way, and stakeholders, they use sometimes together maybe 3 or 4 strategies, more variety, to for their own interest, their own goal. So you see that's where you were to expect also. So we think this may be, what I say, maybe high standard or more mature management, that you look at variety not only one best way, but we saw some stakeholders using several strategies for their own interests, and it's very interesting. Concepts of variety also very to read the explanation.
You just sort of follow that point up with this is one of the key issues we found. I mentioned we found the client's project delivery roles not that well understood, and the roles and responsibilities of who does what, and within the book the section on best practices has almost a recipe book section it was written as a recipe book for projects, but typically who's doing what, and there isn't much of a definition we've seen other than in this work. I think there's a fundamental that the client can never delegate the responsibility for the outcomes. Government, if it's funding something, carries the can. You can't devolve things like you thought you could do. But you need a very competent client as well as a competent delivery organisation. And if either is weak, then the project is at severe risk. And the need for competence in the client team is actually not that well understood. That's one of our key messages. And Marcel's illustrated at the bottom that actually between the client and the project delivery organisation, you need elements of control and elements of dynamic interaction. If it's you do this because I say so and I'm paid, you'll get a suboptimal outcome. If it's we're going to build this whatever you say you want, in both of those, you'll get a suboptimal outcome. And it's a constructive approach between informed clients and competent project delivery organisation that, in our experience, gets the best end result.
Can I make a comment on that diagram? Because we're actually dealing, John and I and Phil, are dealing with an aspect of this at the moment where we're attempting to draw a framework for the synthesis, analysis, comparisons. And when it comes to policy initiatives, we don't have quite the same terminology, but I think that there is a relationship there that you might be interested in. We're looking at control and enablement, and the interface is the interaction that you have. And in that regard, you could actually start off with an enablement, move into control, or vice versa, depending upon the context. So, and this is what I really want to move on to. And it won't surprise you, Marcel, as the topic I'm moving on to, is the importance of context. We're finding the uncomfortable truth is that handbooks, guidelines, you call them recipes, templating, if you like, solutions of major projects, have their costs as well as their benefits. And it's early days for us. Yeah.
Let me just defend to some. The recipe book says, have you thought about, rather than this is the way to do it.
Okay.
So
Right.
we've not.
Well, these are questions.
We've said you must have arrangements for the sharing of risk between contracts.
Right.
But we haven't said you must do it this way.
It's important to step back and explain that we are of the view that there are generic principles wherever you may be.
Yes, I agree.
Right. There are generic, and actually one interesting point that you've raised that we would take home with us is that the generic questions.
Yes, the
The
generic
answer,
questions.
the answer may not be generic, right? And we've not thought of that. So that's thank you for that. So it's not that we don't. It's not that we don't argue that there's generic wisdom, but what we are suspicious of, and of course, because it's an industry, the major project you have tells you have them going all over the world, but the templating of solutions is at one level pragmatic, and I was very interested in your comment about not advising major projects to use new technology. That's path dependency. Shocked me a little bit, but I mean, I can see the logic, but it actually generates you could argue, a retrograde approach. But anyway, that's another subject.
It generates the project that works, however.
Well, no, I'll conclude on what works just in a minute. We were talking about context. And the discussion about context came about from your diagram of control and enablement. And I think we both agreed that you actually might start off with enablement, move to control, vice versa, depending on the context. So I think we all agree. Then when you actually then give attention to context, you then need to know what knowledge is generic to all contexts,
yes,
and what is generic to typology of contexts.
I think reinforcing that from the Ericsson study, many of the team from Marcel have gone on to the fame goals, but one of them, the senior team, went on to the Marmara tunnel in Istanbul, onto the Bosphorus, and was very clear to us that the context being so very different in Denmark, Sweden, and Turkey made much of his experience useless.
Well,
and Sam, reinforcing the point that lessons learned are not always transferable without understanding the context.
Right. What we would like to do though is to assume that even by going to the Bosphorus, that there are still certain generic principles.
Yes.
I mean, at the end of the day, the context still.
I think it was the political, how we had to do with the political masters was very different, but the physical construction was the same.
Yes, I think we have the control and the interaction, and we do not say one is better than the other. And maybe at the control side, you can use better formats, ICT tools like for your cost control or your planning. Maybe one example is the data route. In 1995, I was involved in setting up the new organization. I was responsible for it. And then we said, okay, you need both the control and the interaction. And let's not mix it into one fuzzy thing. Okay, there is a tension, okay, make that tension visible in your organization. So you have one part more on control. Because you have to make contracts with your contractors, and okay, context is changing, but you cannot say to a contract manager every now and then or every 2 months, okay, maybe something changes, and what's the impact on your contract? So we say, okay, you do a contract, you have a good contract, go for it. But on the other hand, we have a more strategy department looking at like an antenna to changing in the context. Maybe there are some things that we think should work, doesn't work. So often you think of the result of actions, but the result is not what you want. So, and that we tried to make that tension visible in the organization and not make some mixture of it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I wonder, do you think that the fact that you would have had to carry out environmental impact assessments before you started, and the necessity within there to look at mitigating factors actually improved your stakeholder relationships? Because in terms of that process, you're almost having to preempt where people are likely to object. Although having said that, of course, you have ended up with incredibly expensive solutions to mitigate.
Yes, in some countries, I say the better route was perhaps an extreme example of mitigating, and that's perhaps there's a bit more of a consensus approach culturally in the Netherlands than in some of the other countries.
But you would say long-term, all infrastructure projects which sit within the EU will require some form of impact assessment, and you are supposed to be looking at alternatives and at mitigation.
But people can do different mitigation methods, affordability and willingness and strategic importance that you can give different answers. I think that will become standardised, but it's very difficult to control the response to those assessments.
Do you think it has benefited the process though, or has it just in effect drawn the process out in terms of time frame for planning?
There's been a few examples where I guess the impact on the project has been unnecessarily delayed. The E18 in Finland got tangled up with somewhat mythical flying squirrels. That put a year into the British projects always get involved in news because actually there's a European species of it's a spotted newt, I think. I'm sorry, it's a crested newt. Sorry, yes, which is common in the UK but it's rare in Europe. So any bit of land in the UK has these newts pretty well, but nowhere in Europe does, and so it's a protected species. We could do with exporting rather a lot of them and maybe evening it up and stopping them being protected species, one could argue, because there's just so many of them here. So that was perhaps a negative example as well. But generally it's thought to be positive, although I suspect that the pulls on my example of the National Park were working the environmental study to their economic benefit.
One last Google. Is it Googling? I don't play cricket, but is it possible to do the throw ball? Yeah.
It does play cricket.
So they do that? Well, anyway.
Marcel doesn't know the rules.
There's a ball you throw at the batsman, which is a little bit dangerous. What's that? Richard knows I don't even like cricket. This concept of what is successful, what is unsuccessful today, actually could be seen to be successful 20 years down the line. A major project today is a success as an environmental disaster tomorrow, making this what works today and all the handbook today actually dangerous. That's the boogie.
I think that's true in terms of end usage and whether you achieve the targets. And one of the slides I didn't show was actually what defining the target is. One of my people I've met through NETLIPSE, and although I didn't study that route, through the network I was asked to give him some assistance, and myself and a colleague from the DFT went to help them out of an impossible situation. And this poor project manager being responsible for building a railway in the Netherlands, the high-speed line, and had delivered it fully. And then, at the point of delivery, he was blessed with the additional remit of getting trains to run, which was not part of the project remit. So you have a perfectly delivered railway, signalled and ready, and going to be 3 years between the project being finished. And can you imagine CTRL being absolutely ready and not opening for 3 years after being 100% finished? That is the situation that they are in the Netherlands. So what is success? Is it building the infrastructure?
Yes.
I would say not. It's achieving the benefits in the business case. The Öresund had very, very poor road traffic use in its first 2 years and was the laughing stock of the media. But actually, it was because the market was assessed properly. And now the housing, the commuting, the Swedes working at Copenhagen Airport, because the rates of pay are better in Denmark than Sweden. Actually, it's exceeding the forecasts, but people only remember that it was condemned in its first 2 years. But I would say it's been successful commercially, but its actually outcomes are different from the prediction.
Yes, I think it's very interesting, and we're very interested also in the research also on that topic, because these projects have, development of these projects is 20 years or maybe more, and how maybe can you anticipate on things, on maybe the context within 20 years that it's changed. How do you deal with that as a decision maker or as a project manager? So that kind of questions we're also asking ourselves. So we are very interested in...
One of the answers, of course, is where you draw the boundary of the project. And that is actually our starting point.
It has to be the widest one that delivers the strategic purpose, not a component of it.
Maybe. Richard, do you have a question on clothes?
No, actually, Stuart sort of addressed it, because I was going to make reference to what you said about the Erasmus link and these emergent changes that weren't anticipated, and they took a certain amount of time to start to accrue, and they weren't what was expected. But I think you really covered the point.
We ended up on television. This was one of our mystery moments. We were in Turin, and we were doing the external validation of the book actually at that day. And our host was Prodi's appointed political commissioner for the building of Lyon-Turin. And we went 10 days after Berlusconi was re-elected. So we suddenly found ourselves, a group of us, including you, Marcel, found ourselves on Italian television, and microphone thrust at you, simultaneous translation, and the question was, did we think that the change of government was going to make any difference to the Lyon-Turin project? And sort of skillfully batted it back and said that one of the key findings of our research was that projects had to be grounded in a political consensus with a long-term agreed purpose, because projects last longer than governments. And the Swiss professor Schalke said to me afterwards, that pause after you said that, you nearly said, especially in Italy. I said, you and I see eye to eye through the work we've done together, and that was exactly what was on the tip of my tongue.
Well, Stuart and Marcel, I would like to thank you very, very much indeed for coming to share your work with us. I mean, it is very, very clear to us, maybe not so much to yourselves, but to us, that there's so much complementarity, and that actually I look forward to more interactions, discussions, as we actually initiate this knowledge. Thank you very much for coming. A small, modest group, but